I'm really excited to be hosting this panel because I think we've got some really, really incredible women whose voices on gender in their fiction have just, really made me think as I've been reading all of their books about a variety of different things. And I wonder how we're going to possibly fit all of our words into the short time that we have. So I'll start at the end here. We've got Randa Abdel-Fattah, who is the author of Does My Head Look Big in This? And 10 Things I Hate About Me, among other things. Randa is also a human rights advocate and very passionate promoter of gender equality, which is actually true of all of my panellists, I should say. JC Burke is the Ned Kelly Award-winning author of the book Pig Boy, which many of you would recognise from the HSC curriculum. She's also the author of The Story of Tom Brennan and a variety of other novels. Erin Gough, her first book, The Flywheel, won the Ampersand Project, was it the 2014 Ampersand Project, which is an award for unpublished manuscripts by Australian writers. And her work is a really excellent addition to the literary canon, exploring different sexualities in YA fiction. And Emily Maguire, who is my kind of Sydney counterpart, she'll be running all of the PD sessions over here in Sydney, is the author of a number of books, but in particular this book here, Your Skirt's Too Short, Money, Sex and Power. And I would like to actually open with a quote from this book. You'll notice if you look at it that when I first started reading it, I started putting little sticky tabs on all of the bits that I wanted to remember, but then I realised I was putting 2 sticky tabs a page and it probably wasn't going to help me remember anything. So I gave up on that, but I would like to read a quote from it. I think it's a really excellent and thought-provoking book, and I think if we could get this book and We Should All Be Feminists by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie into the hands of all young people, then we would have fought half of our battle. Emily says in her book, perhaps the problem is not with the nature of women, but with something external to them. I ask you to consider the possibility that the problem is not with women being scatty or slutty or greedy or lazy or wanting it all or not knowing what they want, but is instead with the narrow way women are perceived and the way these narrow perceptions create a social, economic and political environment in which women are punished for not conforming. All of these authors with me today have not conformed in a variety of ways, and we'll talk about that now. What I'd like to ask first, and I will just go down the line for this question, is what made each of you, at what point did each of you become aware of the gender bias and kind of start actively discussing the ideas around the gender bias in your work? Emily, I'll start with you.
I was actually quite a late bloomer in terms of being aware of gender bias. So I was a terrible, terrible student as a teenager. I was a terrible teenager, I know now. But I was always a huge reader, and I read everything I could get my hands on, and that included the school texts, which is only on reflecting more recently. I realised all the ones I could remember anywhere were by men, and they were great books and plays and poems, and I'm glad I read them, but it actually didn't occur to me to wonder why there weren't any women. And it was only really in my early 20s, when I eventually made it to university as a mature age student, that I started reading more widely and thinking about that. I mean, I remember reading Margaret Atwood, and it was like my head was blown open, and it's opened up this whole world and really, really made me think a lot more deeply about the questions of what books are considered important, because again I looked back to my teen years. I was reading all the books on the school curriculum, and I was also reading widely outside of that, and I do remember thinking, well, these are my fun books, and I think a lot of them were actually by women and stories about girls and women, but I did make that I probably didn't even really have the language to articulate it, but I did have a sense that these books were important and serious and what I should aspire to if I was going to be a writer. And these books weren't, and they were my fun books, which just so happened to be my books about girls.
I think that I am still probably being affected, to be quite honest, by the gender bias unconsciously. I think that it's something that as a writer you struggle against every every sentence you put down on the page. I think probably like a light bulb moment for me as a reader in particular was when I was at university and I was talking to a friend and she was talking about a mutual friend who was a guy, and she was saying, oh no, he doesn't read books by women. And I thought to myself, what do you mean he doesn't never? He's never, none, no Jane Austen, no, none. And I flipped it, obviously. I went, well, what would it be like if I made that kind of a statement? And it seemed absolutely preposterous for a woman to say, oh, well, I don't read books by men. A woman would not say that. And I think at that point I started to really think about what's going on here.
I'm the fourth of 5 girls, and my mother was a journalist and a feminist, and we only were given Virago books to read. So gender bias is very big in my house, let me tell you. And I read all these. My very favourite book is a book written almost 100 years ago called Precious Bane by a woman called Mary Webb. And I never considered that women couldn't fight dragons and couldn't crack the atom and win the Nobel Peace Prize. That was never part of the narrative in my family. But I do, and yet I'm reading this, but I'm still existing. This is as a young woman when I was a young woman in the world. And I remember when I first moved out, taking my mother's. My mother was in hospital, and I nicked her hard copy of the Female Eunuch. And I remember, I was never going to read it. I just thought it looked cool being in my new house just around the corner from here. And I flipped through the page, and I used to remember the page number. I think in this edition was about page 80 something. And I read this passage, and all I can remember now was some of the phrases that terrified of wind and rain, talking about your hair being messed up and having to go on a date and sit there and listen to some male's fatuous self-pronouncements all night. And I thought, oh my God, that woman has just read my mind. And I remember going down to the news agency and photocopying it and sticking it up on the wall of the kitchen, and I used to be able to memorise the whole thing. And so I think in many ways the gender bias thing came to me later and probably in quite a different form. Yeah.
Well, my sort of consciousness about gender bias came in a different sort of trajectory. It started more with an anti-racist consciousness, because for me growing up, I wanted to be white, and it was reflected in the books that I read. So I grew up just voraciously consuming Babysitter's Club and Sweet Valley High and Sweet Dreams and Christopher Pike and R.L. Stine. And I was writing since I was in primary school, and I've still got all my stories. And when I look at them, all the protagonists' names are, Jane and Elizabeth and Michael and Todd, and they're at summer camp and things like that, kids or snow. And it just absolutely had no relevance to my life, Ahmed and Muhammad at Saturday school, Arabic school. I attended a Catholic school in a very multicultural suburb in Melbourne, and I learned Italian as a second language because there was such a massive Italian population in the school. So for me, the bias for me was that I could never see myself reflected in the books that I read. So I was consuming books about basically white characters written by white people. So I was never conscious of that bias until reflecting on it as a teenager. I had a fantastic English teacher, and I think so much comes down to your teachers. And she was a real feminist, and she sort of castigated me for reading all that crap she said, and really introduced me to some really strong literature. And I think she was really instrumental. And then I had a teacher after her who was from England and seriously wore tweed jackets, and I probably smoked a pipe at recess, regressive for a year. But it was through her guidance and sort of direction that I started to realise that there was this huge gender bias, particularly in the books on the curriculum. Because we were an emerging Islamic school in Melbourne, we were the first Islamic school. There was 20 of us in high school when we started. She was able to really just take charge of the curriculum and start from scratch and really bring that into our sort of exposure to literature. And then when I went on to university, it was the same thing. You know, you started to really open your eyes to that trend of just being, you know, exposed to male writers as the important writers. And I've always had a very strong feminist consciousness and to me, it just, when you said flipped out, I thought you went crazy, because I used to flip out all the time about that. And for me, yeah, so it was a different sort of path.
We'll just pass the mic. Thanks. Yeah, well, let's talk about that. Actually, I want to talk about that diversity, because I mean, I think one of the things is that, you know, if women's voices are only taking up 30% of the curriculum, and then Australian women's voices are only taking up half of that, then where are the diverse stories within what it is to be an Australian woman? And I guess I, in particular, would like to hear from you, Randa, and also you, Erin, because I know that, you know, one of the things that propelled you both to write your books was that, you know, lack of books that showed you yourself when you were reading. So I guess my question is, why do you think it's so important that young readers have the opportunity to see themselves in the books that they're reading? And, you know, how do you approach that diversity in fiction? Because I think there is a real danger of, you know, often diverse voices, if there's only one, then they become like the spokesvoice for that banner. And what I love about your books, Randa, is that, you know, your characters in, say, 10 Things I Hate About Me versus Does My Head Look Big in This have such different experiences and attitudes towards who they are, which is, you know, so important, so that people don't just go, oh, okay, we've got that story, we've done that story, we know that character, you know, we need to see individuals. So, yeah, perhaps you could both respond to that.
Yeah, look, I think it's true. I think for those of you who don't know, The Flywheel is my first novel, and it's got a lesbian protagonist. I, as a teenager growing up, I didn't read any books that had anybody who had a diverse sexuality in them. Everyone identified as heterosexual in everything I read. It wasn't really until I got to university and read Mrs. Dalloway, that was actually the first time I saw, I guess it was just a lesbian moment, really, more than anything reflected in a book. And look, I think that it's the kind of thing that, it's a funny thing that happens, because again, I think it is it happens somewhere that you don't even enunciate it, but it speaks to you about your worth. I think that's what it is. It speaks to you about what your society values. It speaks to you about the kind of life that's possible for you to lead, and the kind of life that isn't possible. And I guess that's why it's really important for me to have written a book that does have a lesbian protagonist, because I think that I wanted also to write a book with a lesbian protagonist that was a kind of a fun book to read, that it wasn't some kind of really sad story, because I think there is a history, particularly in gay literature as well, of some very dark tales being told. And I wanted it to be a book that, I guess, starts from the point where, you know, you can actually have positive experiences as a gay woman. And hey, let's just pretend that, you know, that's something that everybody can do. So that's what I wanted to do with The Flywheel. I mean, to talk about your question about how do you, I guess, not become the only person, you know, or how do you avoid that issue of kind of your idea becoming representative for everyone. I mean, I guess one approach is to have diverse characters within your book. So have people who have diverse sexualities, more than one, and have them being quite different. And that's something that I try to do with The Flywheel, and I'm writing another novel at the moment. I'm very aware of trying to do that as well, that you can actually say, well, look, it doesn't mean, you know, you have to be like this character in order to be a lesbian. There's a lot of ways that you can do that. And here are a couple, and hopefully you're not the only one doing it. So people are able to access a whole range of different characters to think about.
When I set out to write Does My Book Begin This, the first draft, I was 15 in year 9, and it was a real intersection between, again, feminism and racism or religious otherizing, because when I looked at bookshelves that contained books that had Muslim female protagonists or characters, they were invariably oppressed, subjugated. They were always set in a desert. They were always narrated by a white savior narrator, and there was that was a sexy, best-selling, money-making cash industry, and it spoke absolutely nothing to the reality of my friendships, the people I'd grown up with, my sense of empowerment through my faith, and my experience as an Australian Muslim woman. And so I really wanted to try and break and subvert that stereotype through a YA novel, like through a YA voice. And it's really funny because when you do that, you also come against another pressure, which is this questioning of your authenticity to speak even, because there's such a resistance to you subverting that stereotype. So I remember when the book was published 10 years later, of course I rewrote the whole thing because it was awful. It was like the angry rantings of a teenager. And when I rewrote it, it was 2005. Geraldine Brooks had a review of it in the New York Times, and she had the audacity to say in the review that the book was unrealistic because a Muslim family would never send their daughter to a co-ed school. And I just thought, you stupid bitch. How to tell me what a Muslim family is going to do? But because she, she has that, that she's given herself that platform to know the Muslim world, to know the insight to a Muslim woman. And the Muslim is a monolithic, homogenous mass of people thinking and seeing and feeling exactly the same thing. She was able to get away with that, this throwaway line, which completely undermined my agency, my individuality, and the individuality of an entire 1.3 billion Muslims around the world. And it's constantly coming up against that pushback, saying, "Oh, well, are you sure you're representative?" But you didn't address honour killings. And indeed, one agent, when I did try and when I very first set out to get an agent with Does My Book Begin This, she had the audacity to say, "Yeah, but is there an honour killing in it?" And I just want to quickly read out to you something that I got just a couple of weeks ago, because we're adapting Does My Book Begin This to a film, and one of the comments from someone in the industry wrote back and said, Amel's issues largely come across as first world problems. Her parents are not forcing her to marry a stranger or preventing her from studying. She's allowed to come and go as she pleases from public establishments to her slam poetry meetings. She's not suffering from any kind of discrimination at school. By comparison, her friend Layla is already a full-time hijab wearer and doesn't make a big deal about this because she's suffering from more existential issues such as her right to education and to choose a husband for herself. I was more interested to hear about Layla's story than Emma's. And it goes on with this kind of tone, which is, give us more of an oppressed Muslim woman so that I can be interested, because, the fact that you're dealing with racism and the angst of being a teenager wearing a veil, that's just not going to do it for me. That's just too first world. Just like, this is what we're up against when it comes to, again, so a male questioning your authenticity as a female to speak about what it feels like to walk as a woman, which no male will ever know what that feels like. And then on top of that, add a hijab to that mix, or add, a racial, minority to that mix. And again, the audacity to say, but I know what it feels like for you. And I think we all get that that pushback that says, well, you're not addressing this issue or that issue, so you're not doing justice to the issue, or you're not doing it that in a way that that reinforces my stereotypes, and that's frustrating.
It's something that Amber and Quamelina talks a lot about as well, about that kind of sense that, she hates it when people sort of say to her, oh, you must write this, you must be representative of the Indigenous voice, as though there's one voice for, every Indigenous experience, which is insanity. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, Emily, because, obviously with all of the research that you've done for your book, and I know one of the things that you're really passionate about is empowering young women and men to be able to write their own story, which involves them, being able to imagine paths for themselves beyond these ridiculous kind of representative stereotypes. So I wonder if you could kind of tell us a bit about what your research found and, how you go about putting that message out to young women and men.
I could probably talk for a couple of hours just on that. I'll try and keep it a bit ordered. So on the one hand, when I talk to teenagers, and this comes out of Your Skirt's Too Short and the book before that, Princesses and Porn Stars, often what I'll do, whether it's boys or girls, is we talk about certain ideas they have about what is a boy or what is a girl, or what is a boy's role, what's a man's role, all those kind of things. And then I try and get them to talk about where that idea came from. And just put it out there for them to discuss rather than tell them how to think about it. Because very often they don't know. They can't actually say. Or they'll say things like, well, just everyone knows. Or it just is. And then I get them to talk about specific individuals in their life. So, whether it's boy or girl, your mum, your dad, your sister, other girls at school, whatever. And do they fit into these particular things? And, it doesn't matter what kind of group it is. More often than not, they'll all start telling you exceptions. And then after a while you realise, you've all just talked for 40 minutes non-stop about all the women you know, for example, who don't fit these stereotypes. Who does? And they can't come up with anyone. They can come up with things like, well, my mum does do this one stereotypical thing, but they've also just talked about all the things she doesn't. So really getting them to connect with the idea of, well, okay, obviously these ideas are out there and some of them have grounding and some of them you do see replicated in people around you. But if you actually look at the connections that you have in your real life and how people behave, it's very, very rare to come across someone who actually fits the kind of stereotype that you might get in certain movies or in certain books sometimes. So that's one thing that I find really, really important. I guess on the other side, in terms of thinking about fiction, because I do teach creative writing to younger kids, so starting from about year one, and something my colleague Bernard Cohen, who started up the organisation I work for, he noticed early on, and I've seen replicated over 5 years of doing it, and this is, I see 30 to 60 children a week, is that girls tend to write 50-50 male and female characters. So whether they're actually boys or they're squirrels or piglets or whatever, they're, gendered, he, whatever, they have names. Boys almost exclusively write male characters from a very, very young age. I've had one boy in 5 years of doing this who has, I've noticed, writes Mrs. Elephant. I don't know where it comes from, a beautiful character. Anyway, and it's not because these little boys are just inherently sexist. At that age, very often what kids are doing is they're imitating the stories that they love and they see. You see it come through in lots of different ways and try and nudge them away from writing exact copies of films and books that they love. And girls are reading more widely in terms of gender because they get the pink books, which are very gendered, and they also read the ones for humans. Boys are only reading those other ones. So when they're writing stories and they're imitating things at this really, really young age, it just doesn't often occur to them to put a girl as the main character. And this becomes, something that we really need to push back on a little and try and challenge them, not necessarily just in gender terms at that age, but to really think about who is not like you, who is as different from you as you can think of. And start having that active creative empathy of putting themselves in someone else's shoes. And that's not just a gender thing, it can go really right across the board.
Does anybody else want to comment on that? One of the things you mentioned was the notion of what it is to be a girl and what it is to be a boy. And that makes me think of the idea of what is a girl's book and what is a boy's book. And Jane, I wondered if you could talk a bit about that, because I feel like, the way your books are marketed, you write both girls' books and boys' books, but, given that you go by the name J.C. Burke, I know that you often get boys who are really surprised to find out, that you're a woman and could possibly write a book that they connect with. So I wondered if you could tell us a bit about your experience with that and maybe also a bit about the kind of decision to go by J.C. Burke and, what led you down that track of writing.
The first book I wrote, White Lies, is in the voice of a 16-year-old boy. And I just connected so deeply with that voice that I knew that there were more stories in me that I wanted to write in the male voice, which is strange because I'm not having any brothers, so I don't know where that came from. And it was boys were quite foreign to me for a long time, you know, they were like these kind of aliens. So I don't know where that came from. So I made that decision early on to use my initials, because I thought, look, boys aren't going to want to read a book about them written by a middle-aged housewife. And I get that, but I guess the idea is if they don't know and you put the book in their hand and they enjoy it, and then they find out she's a middle-aged housewife, I think it takes that kind of prejudice away from, you know, what that early kind of reservation might be. I remember once talking at a big HSC day at UTS, and I'm up there and I've been talking for about 20 minutes, and but there were like about 500 people in the room, and this boy put up his hand and went, "So hang on, just hang on. Are you JC Burke?" And I said, "Yeah, who do you think I was?" I just decided some random just decided to walk in and just grab the microphone and start talking. And he couldn't believe it. He could not believe it. And I guess, as a writer, I take great encouragement from that males can read that book and connect so deeply with it, and yet and there's no judgment ever from them about the fact that it is a middle-aged housewife writing it. There's never any judgment, and I think that's probably what we're talking about with the Stella Schools Program, is trying to somehow bypass that step so that those books can get into their hands and they read them without looking at the cover or looking at who wrote it and then making that decision. My son went to a very conservative all-boys school, and he said, "I never cared about who wrote the book. I was given the book to read, for study." He said, "Looking for Alibrandi and The Outsiders were my two favourite books at school, both written by women." So that's the thing, it's how do you get that book into their hands? How do you bypass that moment of prejudice where they might make that decision not to pick the book up?
I wonder, Randa and Erin, if you could both talk a bit about how your books have been received. You know, have they, or do you know, in your experience with going into schools and seeing some of the students who have read your books, have they been perceived as girls' books, or have you come across boys who have read them, and what have been their attitudes to the books? And if you haven't come across boys who have read them, you know, what are your thoughts on the marketing? You know, do you feel that we should be marketing books in different ways to bypass that gender bias?
I haven't been into any schools yet, but I have received quite a bit of feedback, I guess online through Twitter and that kind of thing. Predominantly it is girls who are reading my books. I occasionally I've had a couple of boys, say they've enjoyed the book, but that's been in the minority. I did hear a story from a bookseller in Perth that was a bit saddening to me, which was about a 13-year-old boy who came into the shop and picked up the book and wanted to buy it, and his mum had a look at the book and read the blurb and decided that he couldn't. So I think there's always that kind of gatekeeping that can go on. The book is in school libraries though, so that makes me very pleased, because I feel like with a good librarian or even just giving kids the capacity to kind of browse the school library and have that access, then it might be able to be read by kids who would otherwise not be able to access it. So I guess we'll have to wait and see for further feedback.
My main audience would be female as well. Some of my books are more pink than others. I think that the Australian covers are a lot more sophisticated in their thinking about gender than the overseas covers. So in the UK, I really struggle sometimes with decisions about covers, because not only do they want to put pink, they always want to put a hijab, even if there's no hijab in the story. I'm not joking. And so, there's that double struggle as well, because they say that it's going to a specific audience, and in their mind, the audience is Muslim, even though most of my readers aren't Muslim. So there's all these politics at play there between the expectations of publishers, who's actually reading the book, who they want to read the book, who they think's reading the book. I think librarians and teachers have a huge role to play as well. So I have been to schools where librarians have said, I've given your book to, and it's quite clear that, the librarian is really just giving the book to the ethnic students, or the Muslim students, because, I understand, like, there's it's an unconscious bias. They feel that that's going to vindicate and reinforce their experience and do what I wanted, which was a book that they can see reflected. But also, I guess the complexity of it is that they're reinforcing the wider narrative, which is that stories about, Muslims or people who don't fit within that white mainstream are sort of exotic deviations from the norm. And it's just a simple rule when you read a book, and if the book has to explain that a character is black or wears a turban, or that's evidence enough of the universalism in which we assume that characters are by default white. And for me, that's the issue. It's about trying to challenge what we consider as universal and mainstream, and really and that's why with my books, I don't just have characters who are of various backgrounds, because that's an issue. I try to really pay attention to the names of characters in the playground. So I could stick an Omar or a Raj in there, and that's it. Just to get that from my children's books to young adults. It's just about getting the readers to see the actual reality of our multicultural society reflected in our literature, because it doesn't. It's not reflected at all.
It's interesting that you should say that about the names, because it can take just one little word to make such a big difference. We recently, with the Stella Prize, did a count of 2 of the 100 best picture books lists, and on both lists only 21 of the main protagonists were female, and some of the examples of what could well be ungendered characters, it was just one little he in the story, like the very hungry caterpillar, which suddenly makes it a book about boys, another book for boys. So, it's really interesting how those little moments in language can really shape so much of what we're seeing. I wonder if I could go down the line again and just have you just each comment on why you think it's so important for people to read outside their own experience, and if you have any thoughts on how we can encourage that and how we can move beyond where we're at now.
For all the importance, and it is really, really important that we put on kids seeing themselves in books, and again, I'll say it is incredibly important. I mean, I feel like as a teenager, my life was saved several times from reading a book where I just felt, I'm actually not literally the only person in the world who feels like this. There is at least one other person because they wrote this book, and that is more powerful than I can say. But the other thing that books are is they're a window to the world, and especially if you grew up, in a fairly small world, which I did, which was a fairly religious suburban environment where I only knew people like me and I only went to school with people like me. Books just opened everything up and showed me, not just, wow, people live in ways that I've never even imagined, but also it's that empathy thing when you're young, really, and people who live lives completely different to me actually feel the same way about things that I do all the time too. And it seems such an obvious thing once you're older and you have seen more of the world and read a lot more, but that can be such a profound thing. And to have that sense, that's why it is so frustrating if books are only going to someone at whoever is at that top end of it saying this is who this book is for, and that's great. It is partly for them, but to have that wider experience of becoming more worldly through reading and just seeing what there is in the world, and it's it's a window to the world. Books can be a map to your future to actually start thinking about things that you never thought you could be either, because you see other people doing it.
Yeah, I think reading about other people makes us better humans. I think it means that we can treat people better. We treat each other better. People who aren't in our immediate circle, but who we understand through literature. And I think that reading, it's such an intensely personal experience that you almost, if you're following a protagonist's story, you can feel the emotion that they're going through and you can feel their journey. And I think having read a book about somebody who's really different to you makes you understand them in a way that, even I would argue watching a film about them wouldn't, because of the intimate nature of reading. In terms of what we can do about it, I guess I'm particularly, because I have a 6-month-old son, it's something that I'm kind of grappling with at the moment in terms of, here's this new person, this little boy, how can we kind of provide him with the reading materials to make him a better human. And I guess one of the things that I'm really keen to do for him is to get him to read more books with female protagonists. And I think that it is very much the role of parents and of teachers and of librarians and caregivers to have an awareness of what unconscious biases are out there and really try to introduce our kids to something broader than their current experience, because that's how they're going to learn.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think empathy is such a great thing that we can develop by reading. And I think it's so that very humbling human experience. It doesn't matter who we are, whether the book was written 100 years ago, or male, female, whatever, that we all have these same very deep feelings, and the need to belong and the need to feel love and what fear is like, and just this universal thing, so that we can read about somebody who's saying his world might be so foreign to ours, but they feel what we feel. And I think that's, like I said, it's grounding, it's humbling, and I think that's a really important thing to experience when you're growing up. I guess in some ways the world is very small, and I think that human factor. Emily was telling me about a bookshop in Newtown that has books in brown paper bags. Do they even have the title written on them?
No, they're wrapped in brown paper.
Yeah.
No, they're wrapped in brown paper, if you've seen it, and they just have sort of keywords. So it might be aliens or dystopia or, family, tragedy, just words like that. So you're buying the book literally without judging it by its cover.
Yeah. I think that could be a really fun thing to do in school libraries and libraries in general.
Well, of course, I think stories change people, but I'm doing my PhD looking at Islamophobia and racism in Australia, and I'm looking at it from the point of view of the perpetrators. So I sit down and I interview people at Reclaim Australia rallies and at the far right, and I'm not racist, but mob in the middle, and and it astonishes me, because very often it's not they start by talking about things in terms of ideology and discourse, but ultimately what's something that's changed them would always be story. It's always a personal connection, it's always a relationship. And the ones who are the most sort of vehemently anti-immigration, anti-Muslim, anti-asylum seeker are often the ones who have never met a Muslim or an asylum seeker. And I really feel that it's the power of connecting with the other and really humanizing the people that we have little in common with, that reading provides. And I think that it is about empathy at the most basic level. It's about empathy, and also as a writer, I feel that I'm also in dialogue with my readers as well, because I'm demonstrating to them, I hope with my young adult books, that I am able to put myself in the shoes of all these different characters, even when those characters, I feel, conflict with my beliefs or I'm writing a book from the point of view of someone who's growing up in a very Islamophobic household, and it's a dual narrative, and he falls in love with an asylum seeker who's on scholarship to a private school that he's attending. And it took a lot for me to get into his headspace and see the world through his eyes. And I hope that my readers can see my name and know that I'm Muslim and that I'm able to write a story from the point of view of this racist boy and his family, and realize that we all have that ability if we just nurture it by sort of letting go of our inhibitions and our fears and actually truly giving ourselves to other people to see the world from their point of view, even if you don't agree with that. That's why it's so important, I think, that we offer people the ability to read, from a wide variety. And I think, like you said, it comes down, you've got to short circuit it, you've got to do it from young, in schools and the homes.
That actually feels like a really nice point to me to maybe open up to audience questions. So does anybody have any questions? I think maybe the best thing will be is if you can shout them out and I'll repeat them and then we can ask for answers just to make good use of the mic. So if you have a question, maybe put your hand up and I'll get you to holler. Anyone?
Oh,
yes.
I'm just wondering if there's anyone on the panel have any responses to the idea of junior fiction. So it's been talked about, this idea of YA fiction and the need to engage the disenfranchised or the neglected voices that are in our society. If that's happening at at a YA level, is there any text that you can refer to that could be something that we could use as an exemplar for a text that gives those voices available to younger students, those in primary school who are still at a stage where normal is anything, and so we could access those young minds at an earlier stage than at this YA level?
Okay, so just I assume most people heard the question, but just to recap, it was how can we address these issues at a junior level in the kind of basic sense of it. I'd like to respond to that quickly first and then I'll pass over to everybody here. We actually have tonight, you may have seen floating around, Ronnie, can you just hold that up in the air? So this is the Stella Schools Education Resource Booklet, and the way we developed that was to come up with a set of general reading questions that could be applied to any book at any level, so that young and old and in-between readers, both boys and girls, can start contextualising what they're reading. Because I think the thing is that, a lot of the issues that we see are stuff that young people and teachers and parents are really aware of, but in the isolation of books that are being read, those issues don't necessarily come out as obvious, and when they're contextualised with this kind of framework and when those nagging questions start playing in repeat on your head, it's impossible not to go, well, hang on, where does this fit into the greater narrative of the world? So that's a really good resource, and it also points to some online links that look at research that's been done that shows that there is definitely a bias at a junior level as well, and that there is a real tendency at a junior level to revert to the masculine for those ungendered characters, such as animals, which I know aren't, typically, aren't exactly ungendered, but in the kind of literary world, they really are. And the tendency to revert to the masculine when we're at the zoo, when we're playing with soft toys, that kind of thing. So addressing those kind of issues at a young level, and also, like was said earlier, implementing challenges such as the brown paper bag challenge, or even just saying to students, I dare you to read a book about a girl, or about somebody that's not you, and that suddenly makes it subversive and gives them that permission to defy the norm. So that would be my response to it, but hopefully some of our panellists maybe have a response as well.
I was going to say, it's probably younger than junior fiction, but the Bec Kavanagh picture books. Mm-hmm. I loved reading them to my kids probably more than they liked hearing them. I thought they were great. Prince Cinders, Princess Smarty Pants, and my favourite one called Hair in Funny Places that my kids were so embarrassed when I brought them to the bookshop. But I love what she does, but they're more picture books. I don't really know much about junior fiction.
It just seems to be an area that is sort of left without a voice for diversity, and I'm just curious about exploring that space because it creates the readers that we're trying to appeal to and draw out and diversify their reading habits. But of course, by the time they get to year 7, in this stage 4 experience, they've already cemented what they're interested or what's, as I said before, being normalised for them. So I'm just curious about that space.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of experience personally in that, but I know that there are resources online. A lot of them are US based, but I think it is getting better in the conversation too. So if you do look up things like feminist kids books and things like that, there are lists out there and really good recommendations for people who've read them carefully. Something else I just want to say that sort of applies to that age group and more widely too is that kids who are really voracious readers or love reading will find their books. They just will, whether teachers or parents are putting them in front of them or not. They find a way to get their hands on books, and they find what their books are, and they'll usually read anything, male, female, whatever, because they're just really, really hungry for books. And so while it is, of course, really important for parents and educators to try and put a diverse range in front of them, they're going to find books anyway. So I guess the more concern is the kids that don't have either parents who either aren't able or don't know to to think about these things, and also in some of our poorly underfunded schools where there's not always an opportunity for teacher librarians or whoever else to go, let's just order in a whole new lot of this book that I read about. And that is where the things like teaching to actually think about reading in a different way and to ask questions about the things they're reading, and with younger kids to write their own stories too, can be a really powerful way of kind of getting around that, I think.
Can you just expand on that, and maybe everybody would like to, what is the power in writing your own stories, and how can we encourage the way young people are writing, not just the way they're reading? How can we encourage the way they're writing to expand these conversations?
That's such a huge question.
All the answers.
Look, I think, again, there are kids who are natural writers or feel themselves to be writers and they want to write and they'll write. With those kids, it is actually easier to kind of encourage them to try something new. Like if they're always writing the same kind of story, which you can tell is something that is just the same kind of stories they're reading, to nudge them in a way of experimenting and setting them challenges to try different things as well. And then you can come across the opposite problem, which are really reluctant writers, and often that is because they actually feel self-conscious about things like their spelling or their grammar, and they think you need to be good at those technical skills of learning to write to actually tell their own stories and to author their own stories. So I actually find it really useful with younger kids to tell them, of course spelling's important, of course grammar is important, but this is, as writers, we write first drafts and you're not publishing it yet, and it's just about getting your best ideas out and expressing your best ideas and really telling the story you want to tell. We can fix that stuff later, and that can be really freeing for reluctant writers at a much younger age and actually at an older age group as well, to say, you don't actually have to have particular skills or be trained in a particular way to be able to write your story that you want to write. It's actually all up here, and if you can think it, you can actually write it, and all that stuff can be fixed up later, and don't worry about it.
Yeah, it's very interesting that Emily just said, you've got to give them permission to do it, and you've kind of got to say it's never going to be published, and in fact
it's not never going to be published, but not published in this draft.
It's the first draft, because for me, I must say that it took me years and years of writing to get to the point where writing the flywheel. I mean, I was thinking of the flywheel for many years. I was kind of tinkering with it for many years, but it took a long time for me to get to the point where I was actually like, could I actually publish this? Is this something that somebody else would want to read? I was actually working on for years, like 8 years or something, really ridiculous and embarrassing, this kind of my big, serious, great Australian novel that had a white, straight male protagonist. It was set, I think there was a lot of bush scenes in it as well, because I thought that was important to win the Miles Franklin. And kind of in the, when I was kind of getting a bit of fatigue with that one, that, had nothing at all to do with my life in the inner west as a lesbian, I decided that I would tinker with this other idea. And that's how the flywheel came about. It came about because I told myself I wasn't actually writing it to be published. And I think that the reason that, we've talked about this already is that I'd never seen a book, I'd never read a book like it before, and so I didn't imagine it would be the kind of thing that people would want to publish. And I think that, part of making young writers feel comfortable about writing their story is to show them as many stories as possible so that they can feel that they have that permission.
I go to lots and lots of schools, and I don't want to say sick of it, but boy, if I could take another gifted and talented bloody writing group, I'm going to scream, okay? And I find this, I really struggle with this idea that only these kids that are gifted and talented get to come to a workshop. And they are not always the best writers. And very often those reluctant writers are the very, very good writers. I did a very difficult writing workshop in a rural high school where there were only about 9 kids in the class, but we had to have 4 teachers in there. And the body language was incredible. I walked in, and they were mostly, I think there might have been one girl, but they were mostly boys, and they were all sitting on the outside of the classroom on the desks, and they had all written something first to be. That's what they had to do. They were forced to. And I went back to my motel room and I read these stories, and there was something fantastic in every single one of these stories. And I made some little certificates and got some caramello bears, and we did a bit of a prize giving thing, and then we started to talk, and I started to tell them, you're getting this award for this because you just gave this incredible, that's called a simile, and the way you said that made me feel like this. And as the hour progressed, these boys just started moving into the centre of the class, away from the outside. I was the one that probably got the most from that hour, but I just thought it's giving everybody a chance. And I think because everybody has a voice, but not everybody, if they're not given a chance and they're always going to be told they're hopeless and they're dumb and not gifted and talented, they're never going to have an opportunity to find that voice. So I think really everybody has to have a go.
Obviously I agree with everything that was said. I think there is, I learned a lot of my writing through imitation. So there is something to be said in sort of trying to mimic the work of writers you love, just in terms of learning the technical skills and developing that skill. I did that when I was in primary school and sort of when I started out in high school, I just mimicked a lot of the writers that I loved and learned that way until I felt confident enough to feel that I had my own story. And that's what I try to tell students as well when I run writing workshops, that there's, a lot of them feel that the only legitimate story is, Twilight or big fantasy. They never realise that the story is staring at them in the face, that they can live their own lives. And it's just, it sounds so stereotypical and trite to say it, but they really do need to be told that, they should have confidence in their own story. And I also like the point of view that they should also learn without appropriation. I mean, it's a delicate sort of balance, but it's complex, but without appropriating other people's stories, at least trying to put yourself in other people's worlds. So I try and get the male students to write from the point of view of a female character, the females to write from the point of view of a male character, and to challenge them in that way, to basically understand that everyone's experience of the world is different, that your experience of Australia or the larger society is different, because of everyone's differences and backgrounds. So hopefully get them to understand that way.
Amazing. Are there any more questions?
I just want to say thanks very much. As an English teacher, I think one of the main problems that we actually face is that we're jammed for time with teaching creative writing, and that really impacts what we're going to see from our future generations. There's no time. That's the last thing on our plate. It's the first thing that I'd want to teach, but we're also busy trying to teach to the curriculum. So we need a twofold change. We need major changes to our curriculum and our syllabuses, especially in New South Wales, so that we do have more female writers on there. and so that I don't have to teach David Williamson's The Club to a bunch of kids in the town who are rugby league mad. That's just never going to work. And it doesn't speak to me and it doesn't speak to my kids. And I think we also need to just have more time. There's got to be some way we divvy up time in the classroom. Yes, critical theory and critical analysis skills are important in senior English, but I just find it's always the thing that, and I would say most other English teachers here feel the same way, it's the thing that we teach at the last moment, and, we can't. I just read the same story 50 times for my students about dystopian romances, and I don't want to read another one of those, but I think that's the result. That is the result of having, very little time spent on that in the earlier years. So anyway, that's just some ideas to throw at you.
Thank you so much. We're all on board. Were there any other questions? I can't see people down the back, but I don't.
Can I make a comment?
Sure.
I was at a boys' school for about 7 years at work in the library, and it was a 7 to 10 school. It was a pretty rough school, and the boys, all they wanted to read were books about war and things like that. So I used to say to them, "You want to know about girls?" Because it was obvious they were getting very interested. The only way to find out about girls is to read these books, which were with female protagonists, and they all started getting in on this. They were reading all these books, and I realised very quickly all they needed in front of their peers was license.
Yeah.
Because I really did. By the time I left there, I realised the depth of. I felt in many ways the boys were often much more expressive and more emotional than the girls, and they just needed that license. And I used to help them write their, love letters and poetry, so because it was a good way to get them into reading poetry. But certainly, we had a very big collection of fiction with female protagonists and all about females, and it was worth trying.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is so true, and it seems so obvious, doesn't it? Like, why would they not want to know about girls? And I think that really sums up what we're trying to say is that the gender bias doesn't do anybody any favours, because it implies to boys that they don't have the capacity to understand complex emotional landscapes, and it implies to girls that they don't have the capacity to dream a future for themselves where their lives aren't limited by their gender. So I think that's a really good spot to finish on. So thank you everybody so much for coming.